Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you might be, and welcome to a post about the publishing industry. It's called The Midnight Library. When I quit my job as a physicist and started writing books, I did it to reorganize my sense of myself and my past. I wanted to impose order upon an inner world that felt disordered. And when I looked at the hordes of people out there who are writing their own books, I initially assumed that this ordering principle played a role in their motivation as well. However, when I started to communicate with those who had been writing for years, despite no publishing success, I found that their motivation was more often escapism or an obsessive habit, like whittling wood in the hopes that it would extend their vision past a sort of sensory cage where they only really can see the present moment and what they look like and what the person next to them looks like. It seemed to me that these people wrote to get away from themselves, to try to get a new perspective, and they hoped that others would find their writing similarly useful as a tool to escape. It seemed that many of these people had started digging a hole, hoping to find gold and validation, but instead of admitting defeat, they kept digging in the hope of reaching China or perhaps gaining the approval of their parents. These sorts of writers struck me as singularly unconscious because they weren't particularly interested in why they were writing. They were just doing it because it felt good, and they weren't really sure about what their writing was saying about life and everything. There were alien babies, otherworldly flying half-human creatures, and gruesome conflicts between strangers that filled the pages in a self-indulgent style that aimed to surprise and entertain rather than make people think about what these stories implied about reality. I am, of course, biased. Fantasy novels are not everyone's cup of tea, yet George R. Martin achieved crossover success because his fantasy world delivered oblique commentary on the real world. Regular readers demand that sort of commentary because they like to feel that they are learning from a book, whereas hardcore fantasy readers only demand to be transported to another realm. There's nothing wrong with that, of course. It does bother me, however, that when there are so many writers at work, only a small fraction can profit, and to beat the competition, they usually learn to steal. Because if you want to accumulate an audience, you need to publish frequently, at a superhuman pace, really, and it is a lot easier to compose something appealingly if you rehash the best bits from everyone else's work. Not only sometimes this form of obsessive creative theft crosses the line into plagiarism, but most of the time these writers are good enough at masking their sources. They call what they do craft and tell everyone that there are no new stories, as they flood self-publishing platforms and publishers with their well-crafted, formulaic stories. And they tend to get the most success if they dumb their stories down to really one-dimensional types of thinking. So for me, I think the purpose of a story is to help people think in multiple dimensions, to be able to think from different perspectives and tie those all together. But when people are shooting to grab the widest possible audience, they focus their plots to the point where it's just an oversimplification that teaches most people nothing. Or it gives them a narrative to help them structure how they see the world, but it doesn't really help them think. Maybe I'm sour grapes, right? Maybe I'm just not able to think about how people really are. The fraction of authors who are writing to say things that cannot be said out loud, or to learn something new about themselves and about their world, are, in my opinion, the only ones worth reading. But they are difficult to find amidst a flood of well-crafted, oddly subsidized, one-dimensional noise that is somewhat manipulative. So if you have a person who can think in multiple dimensions, writing something that's in only one dimension, in order to try to steer people into thinking in that particular line, I find that it has a very bad effect on the people who read it. They're trying to do something that they really shouldn't do. They should be true to their authorial voice and not be using it as a tool to manipulate. So when you have this flood of well-crafted, subsidized, one-dimensional noise coming from this chorus of authors, the best these writers can hope for is that someone will steal their words and polish them into a mass marketable form. Maybe you wrote something that was multidimensional and then somebody steals it and turns it into a one-dimensional product that's mass marketable. And I find that the worst thing that can happen is what happened to me when I wrote a somewhat feminist novel. I mean, I'm not a crazy feminist. I'm married with 3 kids, in which, well, this novel was plagiarized by a guy who I would characterize as being a men's rights activist. I mean, I gave the protagonist dignity despite adversity, and he depicted her getting ridden by an alpha male. I do wonder why I couldn't get an agent to even look at my work, even though the people who reviewed it like it a lot. And when I posted it on Quora, I mean, lots of people signed up to read it. So it's not bad. And I wonder if the reason why agents wouldn't look at it is because I wrote in a genre that is dead on arrival. And they didn't even take a look because I didn't use the right keywords. I just watched a video and if you click on the link below, you'll see a video on genres that are dead on arrival from the perspective of publishers. And a publishing insider in the video talks about how after one book succeeds at subverting reader expectations, the market will be flooded with copycat works until the audience gets sick of the rehashed tropes and storylines, thereby killing the entire associated genre. She talked about how subverting reader expectations and reinventing a genre can only be accomplished by established, famous writers, and about how debut authors have to write according to a recipe if they want to be published at all. And this means that fresh voices have zero chance to break through, especially if they are doing something that's new or multidimensional. They have to be filtered through a one-dimensional industry insider mouthpiece. And I find this quite sad because it constricts people's ability to think in multidimensional ways. And it is sad that there are so many professional writers who are willing to slavishly chase trends. And it is sad that readers can't identify what's being done to them when they're being fed this sort of material. Of course, in an industry that is warped by money laundering and purchased reviews, it is hard to know how much of this reflects genuine reader habits and how much is an illusion created by a manager who is trying to set the zeitgeist from the comfort of an armchair. I imagine. Let's see. The hoi polloi are getting restless and whispering, "Eat the rich. It must be time for more books about sexy rich vampires who fight bad guys." Those stories tend to make people more aspirational rather than jealous. Oh, they are chanting in the streets and carrying pitchforks? Then we will need some more books about zombies. That should quell the disturbance. Self-published dystopian novels are becoming popular again, you say. We can't have that sort of uncontrolled social commentary. We will need to compete with those novels by producing some dystopias of our own. However, we will subvert the message delivered in the self-published novels by making the destruction of the dystopia an exercise in futility. Now, I'm sure that there is no actual strategic conversation of this sort, but perhaps one takes place on a metaphorical level. I am truly disgusted with how the publishing industry functions because Not only do they encourage people like me to pointlessly run into their gatekeepers over and over until I get tired and give up, but they steal from people like me without a second thought. I've seen that industry insiders can use established authors as fronts to launch material that they stole and reworked, and when everybody gets a slice of such a pie, there are more people willing to contribute to market it. If there are enough thieves working together, nobody feels like they committed a crime. They were just doing their jobs. It's like just a regular capitalist economy, but with other people's ideas and their voices, really. God forbid that you write, edit, and publish your work all by yourself, because then no one else can claim credit for the pie you baked, and no one will help you make a name for yourself. Necessity is the mother of invention, yet success has many fathers. Now, Matt Haig is a literary brand that surely has many fathers, many bosses perhaps. He has published 2 novels per year for the past 10 years, and with 500,000 Twitter followers, or bots, how many are bots? He acts like Twitter is his full-time job, tweeting 50 times every day. This is one reason why, after all of his previous novels were written from a male perspective, I had my doubts when I saw that his most recent novel used a female protagonist. I mean, it just didn't sound like something in his skill set based on how he portrayed other female characters, sort of one-dimensional cardboard cutouts. I mean, I'm sure he wrote the book down, but it seemed like the concept and the perspective must have been given to him perhaps as a detailed beat sheet that he could fill in with all of his characteristic self-help wisdom and cardboard cutout characters. I imagined that he was given some notes to hit in order to encourage certain types of political opinions that his handlers would want him to promote as part of their efforts to engineer how people think. After all, Matt Haig has proven that he can produce a consistent, trite, and predictable product twice per year, and because he has been embraced by the publishing industry, he can count on a chorus of occasionally well-known names to offer their voices in empty 10-word bites of praise that will fit nicely on his book jacket. It is factory-produced literature and marketing, and every step in the process strips away a layer of authenticity from what originally inspired the story. The writer, a writer like Matt Haig, is just a figurehead who must focus on tweeting, while his publisher makes sure that a nice article about his struggle with depression comes out right before his books are released every 6 months. I mean, this is a portrait of a modern author. 50 tweets per day. 50. Does that sound like depression to you? Maybe. It's the modern form of depression. So, then there are the reviews on Amazon and Goodreads. Matt Haig's newest novel isn't even available for purchase yet, and it already has 365 Goodreads reviews, all 5-star, bought and paid for by a NetGalley, except for the 7 reviews that gave it 1 star and complained that it was trite, formulaic, and copied from self-help books. Most reviewers are for sale and will copy and paste praise for one and all, but a tiny minority actually read the book. I have read one of his other books, and I can agree with the 1-star assessment of his writing. It's really aimed at the lowest common denominator. I read that book in one day, which generally means that it is terrible and that I've rushed to the end to get it over with. He wrote that the book was a form of therapy, and after thinking about the plot, I wondered what sort of therapy that might have been. He had created an angry young tattooed woman who was the protagonist's accidentally estranged daughter, and it seemed like the author wrote the book to force himself to humanize such a character after he or someone he did he knew did something horrible to the sort of woman that men often have a hard time respecting. I'm speculating, of course, and I'm also being mean. Why am I being so mean towards Matt Haig? So many people love him. The truth is that I'm highly irritated to see that the premise and character types he used in his most recent novel, The Midnight Library, which is published today, is markedly similar to that of the novel I self-published in May of 2018, so 2 years ago. I'm suspicious because this sort of copying of someone else's concept, plot, characters, it's not the first time I've seen a dumbed down copy of my work produced by someone like him. Since 2 years is about the amount of time for a complete story to make it to publication after being given to a professional writer who already has a publishing house to edit, produce, and promote the work for which he got an $800,000 advance, I am suspicious that my work has been pilfered yet again. I mean, I haven't read the whole thing. I'm going to buy it today and I'll read it. And I know that you can't steal ideas, and a charge of plagiarism requires a lot more similarity than just a similar premise, plot, and a set of similar characters. I haven't seen the whole book yet, but I am a scientist and I like forming hypotheses and testing them. My hypothesis is that when I read this book, I will find more similarities with my novel than I already saw in the premise, where the librarian is comparable to this Ariel character I have, where just a list of things. The premise was a parentless woman's life and sanity fall apart, and every time she dies, she ends up in another version of her life, accompanied by her cat. I mean, you could say that about my book too. The OA used a similar premise in 2018, where she's sort of killed, and it's similar. And I'm sure that Star Trek used this premise in a different way that didn't focus on the discoveries of a single woman. I'm also sure that ever since Hugh Everett's Many Worlds hypothesis about quantum mechanics, stories like this have been written many times. I mean, just think about It's a Wonderful Life. That probably even, that may have even been the start of this whole train of narrative. But when the theme is coupled with a woman's perspective and set in a somewhat contemporary world, and she suffers from similar life experiences, she has a similar mentor and issues with a cat, the story begins to assume more and more uniqueness. When such a woman's perspective is written by a man who typically uses male protagonists, the author's influences doubly spark my suspicion. I'm also not happy with Matt Haig's work because not only is the premise and character type lifted, the title is also stolen from another author, a recent book by someone named Nick Shadow. People in the publishing industry seem to think nothing of stealing to create their patchwork, ragdoll hack jobs, and they know that if they all work together, it doesn't seem like stealing. I tried to do a mathematical analysis of the plots of the last 2 people who stole my novel, but I haven't gotten a copy of Matt Haig's book yet, so I can't do that quite yet. I'll make another post later. A cursory analysis shows that if the premise is broken down into 10 points, they all overlap with that of my first novel. Woman with absent parental figures suffers setbacks in her life and feels trapped. Accompanied by her cat and a librarian mentor, she explores her regrets about her life choices through a magical library that she enters every time she dies. In one of those lives, she was a scientist that was killed by her experiment. In another life, she became famous and thinks about the drawbacks of fame, that kind of thing. That's my novel. That's his novel, too. The possible combinations of 10 plot points, estimated as 10 factorial, is 3.6 million. And that is a number which is far larger than the 100,000 new novels published each year. Or it implies that this plot should show up on average once every 36 years. after the multiverse concept is introduced to popular discourse. So when it shows up more often than this, it's likely that people are copying from one another rather than coming up with a plot that strikes a resonance with their real life. So I think the likelihood is high that someone gave him the outline of my book and said, "Matt, baby, I've got a book for you to write up. A newbie wrote this story and she made it too layered and complicated for a commercial audience. Can you dumb her story down and season it with some of your brand of special self-help book sauce?" Readers don't like to feel dumb, and it seems like just the right sort of thing for the zeitgeist. It will sell, maybe 1,000,000 copies, and provide you enough dough to cover a few trips to Majorca for you and the kids. It will probably only take you a month or two to rewrite. Who cares if the story draws from a real person's lived experience, and that she took 2 years to craft the story and explores all of its cultural resonances? She should get back to her day job and leave the writing to us professionals. This is my picture of how the industry works. What I'm trying to say is that I'm sick of the fakeness of internet authors who tweet 50 times per day and become famous novelists because they've been selected by a publishing house and turned into a brand that publishes 2 novels per year. I know I am the real deal because I am one of those people who quit her job because she had a story to tell. And I don't like seeing so many professional copycats propped up by the system and living off of the lifeblood of people like me who had to write my story because I needed it to sort out my goddamn life. I mean, screw those thieving vampires and screw the system. I think it needs, yeah. So I've calmed down since I wrote this, but what I've learned since self-publishing my first novel is that it takes a couple of years of wasted time fighting against this publishing system to figure out that unless you are a pre-vetted player of the game, whatever you write will be stolen and published by someone with an established brand. So what is an author to do? Because writing is a powerful tool for people to sort out their lives and help them, fix the disorder in their own minds in order to feel sane so that they aren't prey to, conspiracy theory groups. So should an author just keep creating for the sake of creating? Should she boycott the system? Should she make fun of frauds who steal and buy reviews? Definitely. Should she steal from the frauds at the same time that she laughs at them? I don't think so. What else should we expect from a system in which one of its most successful authors, for example, Malcolm Gladwell, said in his masterclass, "The job of the writer is not to come up with the ideas, but to be patient enough to find the ideas." I mean, son of a bitch. What are you teaching kids about what writing is about? You're teaching them to be shithead plagiarists. I mean, real writers know the difference. Real writers find their ideas by digging through and resorting their memories. And I think kids should understand that this is the process through which you extract the healing power of writing. It's not by copying somebody else's ideas and begging somebody to look at what you've produced to get some attention. That's the wrong way to fix yourself. Begging for attention with stolen content? Broken. Thank you for watching. I hope my anger didn't annoy you too much. Until next time.